It's becoming really relevant these days. I think many engineering companies actually looking at this to be probably a permanent fix to all the challenging hiring, recruitment, and getting talented people. And you're saying in the book in the beginning that you think remote is here to stay. Pandemic has been easing off in the few parts of the world. Things are starting to get back to normal. Do you think remote work will still be there, or any kind of personal prediction about where this will lead to?
Sure. So I think maybe a year ago, people would have said that no one is ever going to go back to an office ever again. Now, I don't think that's true. And we've certainly seen very recently, around the time of recording this, that Google are starting to get employees back into the office in Silicon Valley. So I think for some large companies and probably some traditional companies, they will start going back to the office soon. However, there will still be a huge amount of engineering work going on from remote locations, and there'll be a huge amount of fully remote companies. And I think the pandemic really shifted that societal change forward very quickly. And I think what's most important there is not necessarily to do with the people running the companies, but I think employees realize that they don't have to commute anymore if they don't want to, that they can live somewhere that isn't a city with offices if they want to. So I think really just the amount of options that are open for people who are looking for work has dramatically increased. I think many people, especially people who are parents or caregivers or have elderly family that they want to be around, they've experienced 2 years of potentially being able to be around. And now they're thinking, I want to keep that. So yeah, I think remote is definitely here forever now, as far as I can tell. And the tools that we're using to be remote are only ever getting any better.
So you mentioned the keyword which I captured, the options now is becoming a viable option, because previously, even if you try to find remote work, there are maybe just a minimal number of good companies that open remote work. But seems like now, even like big companies providing these options, good talents has a chance to actually try remote work working at the big startups or giant techs as well.
Yeah, you're right. And I think before, certainly 4 or 5 years ago, I was very interested in being fully remote. But as you said, the options were very limited. Additionally, not only were the options limited, like often it was remote, but actually you had to be in a certain country or you had to be a contractor. And then it was just very difficult to be employed that way. And I think also the fallback was difficult. So now, I think, for example, if you really wanted to relocate with your family to be near other family or to live somewhere you always wanted to live somewhere a lot cheaper, for example, then that was a big risk 4 or 5 years ago because you'd maybe go remote, work for a small remote company. It's kind of niche. And then if that didn't work out, you'd think, okay, well, I might not have a job. Whereas I think now there's so many remote jobs and so many remote jobs at very large companies where you get all of the usual HR support and proper arrangements to be employed, that if you do relocate to be remote and something doesn't work out, then there's plenty of jobs now. And I think it's a much more accepted and less risky option.
You mentioned about support. So we have been training ourselves in the last 1 year or so to be more used to remote work. I'm sure in the beginning, some people didn't probably like it or didn't get familiar to how things work in the remote work. Maybe you could take a few minutes to actually give your tips how for people to get started to do remote work, any kind of basic setup or tools that they must have at home or maybe at the place where they work at.
Sure. I think a lot of these tips are probably going to sound very boring, but I think they're kind of essential. So think about working in an office. You have like a good desk, an ergonomic setup, a good chair, all of the things that make you sort of a healthy employee that's not going to get RSI and is going to have somewhere that they can sit or stand for most of the day without being very uncomfortable. So I think that's where things didn't go right at the beginning of the pandemic, is that many people had living arrangements that were not meant for working. So either people didn't have desks, they didn't have the space, they didn't have any of the usual things that they get in the office. So obviously it was a diminished experience. So if you want to do remote working for the long term, then yes, you have to make sure that to the best of your ability in the space that you have, you're able to have a permanent place to work. You've got all the proper desk, monitor, the lighting is correct. All of the usual things that in that email that you'd get at the office about ergonomics. And then you go, I don't really care about that. That is actually very important when you're at home. And having a space that is ideally some privacy away from those who are in your house, not because what you're doing is secret, but just for focus and just to keep the noise at a minimum. I think also tools as well, is having a healthy routine and setup is incredibly important. So part of the reason that going to an office is nice in one sense is that you always travel in and out at the same time of the day. So you have a defined end and defined start of your workday. If you're in an office, you may see everyone go to lunch at the same time. So therefore you kind of naturally follow by mirroring the behavior of others, and you have some time off for lunch and you go and talk to people. And I think when you work at home, it's very easy for all of those boundaries to be removed. Getting out of bed in the morning late, and then you end up going straight on the computer. You don't have any breakfast. You end up working through your lunchtime because you get busy. You just kind of never really sign off at the end of the day because you keep checking things, or you're using your laptop for personal things as well, and you can't stop checking messages. There's so many things where the success that you want in remote has to come through additional discipline and habits that you have to instill yourself. And I think you get a lot of that discipline and habits in an office through osmosis by observation of others, but you have to do that proactively for yourself. That can actually be very hard because technology is addictive. I find Slack very addictive. The little notifications ping off all the time. It's like, oh, what's that message? Oh, what's that message? So it's kind of like pruning down your interruptions, pruning down the things that drag you away from your home life, and making sure you've got a clear separation and treat it like work.
So as you're describing some of these things, I'm laughing myself because I can see myself doing that, wake up and just jump into the desk and work. Probably there's no boundary of the start and end time. There's no commute anymore. So for people, I think this is probably relevant, right? How do you manage yourself? How do you manage your time? How do you manage your workload? So meeting fatigue and all these slack and disturbances all day long. How can we probably do this better? Like managing our time, managing our energy and all that.
Yeah. So I think there's maybe two sides to this. So the first side is the things that you can do for yourself. And then the other side, I think, is all to do with the things that you establish with your team. So norms of how you communicate and what you expect from each other. So I think I've already touched upon a lot of the things you can do for yourself, making sure that you work set hours every day that are predictable. Try your best to simulate some of the aspects of what you would do if you were going into the office, so that the beginning and the end of the day, you go for a walk. At lunchtime, you make sure you eat some proper food. You take that hour away from the computer. You do the sorts of things that you would do in the office that chunk your time up properly. And definitely in terms of self-management, make sure that you are organizing your time in your calendar. I personally do it in such a way that my calendar's visible to everybody in terms of what they can see. Now I'm working for Shopify, which is very sort of US and Canada based, and I'm in the UK. But that actually gives me an advantage because it means that in the mornings, it's usually a lot quieter than the afternoons. So I block out my afternoons as here's times to have meetings. And then it means that in the morning, I block my time out for just focus work. And that's how I run my day. Usually sort of morning is my IC element of my role and focusing on things on my own. And then the afternoon is kind of the more social interaction bit. But all of that only works if you go to the second part of what I was talking about, which was the expectations with your team. If you are remote now and you're going to be remote in the future and you haven't talked to your team about what you expect from each other and you establish some norms, if you don't do that, it can be really complicated. It isn't hard to set norms. I mean, norms are all about you and your team understanding what it means to be online, what the kind of response times are for different means of communication. For example, if I send you an email, is it okay to not have a reply until tomorrow? Because if the whole team's cool with that, then that's great. It reduces friction. It reduces stress. What does a direct message on Slack or Teams mean? Is that really important? Should that come through to my phone notifications, or is that actually just another form of email? And as long as I look at it once a day, it's not a problem. So I think having those discussions with your teams about what you expect from each other can greatly help enforce healthy habits at home.